is he's cooking. Yeah. Come around so I can, otherwise I can't see anyone. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Ballava Giribharadhare Gopi Jana Ballava Giribharadhare Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachare Yamunatira Vanachare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Ballava Giribharadhare Gopi Jana Ballava Giribharadhare Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Vraja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachare Yamunatira Vanachare Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihare. Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Jai Prabhupada, 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 Prabhupada. Jai Jai Prabhupada, 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 Prabhupada. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahansa Parivrajacharya Status Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki ISKCON's founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada Ki Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Shri Radha Radhanath Ki Shri Giri Govardhan Ki Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu Ki Sankirtan Yagya Ki Gopremanande. All glories to the assemble devotees. All glories to the assemble devotees. All glories to the assemble devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4, Chapter 3, talks between Lord Shiva and Sati. And today we're going to read verses 13, 14, and 15. Which of those verses is on the sheets? Is 13 there? 15? Okay. And 14 is not either, right? Okay, so I'll just read 13 and 14 and then we'll do 15 together. Katam sutaya pitri geha kotikam, nishamya deha suravarya nengate, anahuta ap yabiyanti solridam, Bharturgoro deha kritas chaketanam. Translation: O best of the demigods, how can the body of a daughter remain undisturbed when she hears that some festive event is taking place in her father's house? Even though you may be considering that I have not been invited, there is no harm if one goes to the house of one's friend, husband, spiritual master, or father without invitation. Verse 14. Tanme prasidedam amarcha vanchitam kartum bhavan karu niko batarhati Tvayatmanoradheham adabra chakshusha nirupita manu grihana yachita. O immortal Shiva, please be kind towards me and fulfill my desire. You have accepted me as half of your body. Therefore, please show kindness towards me and accept my request. 15, which we'll do responsively. Rishiruvacha evam giritra priyaya bidbashita pratyabhyadhata prahasan surit priya samsmarito marma bida kovag ishon yan aha ko vishva srijam samakshata rishirvacha evam giritra priyaya bibashita pratyabhyadata prahasan surit priya samsmarito marma bida kuvagishon yanahako vishva srijam samakshata rishirvacha evam giritra priyaya bibashita pratyabhyadata prahasan surit priya samsmarito mara bidakuvadgishon yanahako vishva srijam samakshata rishirvacha evam giritra priyaya bibashita pratyabhyadato prahasan surit priya samsmarito marma bidakuvadgishon yanahako vishva srijam samakshata ladies. Siravacha. Rishi Uvacha. The great sage Maitreya said, Evam, thus, Giritra, Lord Shiva, Priyaya, by his dear wife, Abhibhashita, being spoken to, Pratyabhyadatta, replied, Prahasan, while smiling, Suhrit Priya, dear to the relatives, Samsmarita, remembering, Marmabhidha, heart-piercing, Kuvak Ishun, malicious words, Yan, which words, Aha, said, Ka, who, Daksha, Vishvasrijam, of the creators of the universal manifestation, Samakshata, in the presence. Translation. The great sage Maitreya said, Lord Shiva, the deliverer of the hill Kailas, having thus been addressed by his dear wife, replied smilingly, although at the same time he remembered the malicious, heart-piercing speeches delivered by Daksha before the guardians of the universal affairs. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. When Lord Shiva heard from his wife about Daksha, the psychological effect was that he immediately remembered the strong words spoken against him in the assembly of the guardians of the universe. And remembering those words, he was sorry at heart. Although to please his wife, he smiled. In Bhagavad Gita it is said that a liberated person is always in mental equilibrium in both the distress and the happiness of this material world. Therefore, the question may now be raised why a liberated personality like Lord Shiva was so unhappy because of the words of Daksha. The answer is given by Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. Lord Shiva is Atmarama, or situated in complete self-realization, but because he is the incarnation in charge of the material mode of ignorance, tamagun, he is sometimes affected by the pleasure and pain of the material world. The difference between the pleasure and pain of this material world and that of the spiritual world is that in the spiritual world, the effect is qualitatively absolute. Therefore, one may feel sorry in the absolute world, but the manifestation of so-called pain is always full of bliss. For instance, once Lord Krishna in his childhood was chastised by his mother Yashoda, and Lord Krishna cried. But although he shed tears from his eyes, this is not to be considered a reaction of the mode of ignorance, for the incident was full of transcendental pleasure. When Krishna was playing in so many ways, sometimes it appeared that he caused distress to the gopis, but actually such dealings were full of transcendental bliss. That is the difference between the material and spiritual worlds. The spiritual world, where everything is pure, is pervertedly reflected in this material world. Since everything in the spiritual world is absolute, in the spiritual varieties of apparent pleasure and pain, there is no perception other than eternal bliss. Whereas in the material world, because everything is contaminated by the modes of material nature, there are feelings of pleasure and pain. Therefore, because Lord Shiva, although a fully self-realized person, was in charge of the material mode of ignorance, he felt sorrow. Rishiruvacha evam giritra priyaya bibashita pratya biadatta prahasansarit priya samsmarito marama bidakuvagi shun yan ahako vishvasrijam samakshata. The great sage Maitreya said, Lord Shiva, the deliverer of the hill Kailas, having thus been addressed by his dear wife, replied smilingly, although at the same time he remembered the malicious, heart-piercing speeches delivered by Daksha before the guardians of the universal affairs. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestha Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Tyadeshatarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Well, this is a very profound pastime. There's so many different aspects to it and so many important factors which come into play, come into effect in different ways at different points in the development of the pastime. It's really extremely instructive. And this verse, and particularly the purport of Srila Prabhupada, is really a wonderful purport explaining a somewhat inconceivable aspect of the pastime and just a very, very important aspect of the pastimes of Lord Krishna. So basically in the purport, Srila Prabhupada is focusing on the reaction of Lord Shiva to the appeal of his wife to at least be that she would be allowed to go to this big sacrifice of her father Daksha, big sacrifice, and as has been described on a number of occasions, it's also a big social event, because she's been talking so much, Sati has been talking so much about wanting to see her mother and her sisters and her friends and their husbands and all these different people. And that doesn't really have so much to do, or doesn't really have anything to do with the actual sacrifice, the actual religious performance which is going to take place just now. It's just coming in the immediate, very immediate future. And it's not part of a fire sacrifice that everyone must dress up very nicely and spend time with their relatives and friends and so on. So there are two aspects to it. And she, Sati, has been emphasizing the social aspects, which is natural. In a sense, you can say it's natural for a woman, but it's also just natural for any conditioned soul. She has just briefly referred to the actual sacrifice, the actual religious program, and even that was indirect, that I want to see the flapping flags around the sacrificial arena. They have these flags and things, so she wants to see the flapping flags. That's all she said, actually, about the actual sacrifice as such. And that's not really so much to do with the actual sacrifice. So, particularly Shri Radha Radhanath Shri Giri Govardhan Shri Caitanya Mahaprabhu Ki Jai. So Srila Prabhupada in the purport, as we have seen, has quite extensively discussed about Lord Shiva's reaction, his two reactions after hearing all this from Sati. And he's also elaborated on the difference between part of Lord Shiva's reaction, at least, and the reactions that take place in the hearts of the devotees in the Lord's pastimes in the spiritual world, and just the Lord's pastimes. And it's interesting and it's instructive. So Lord Shiva, as we said, he's responded in two ways. Because of affection for his wife, he smiled when she made her whole very emotional type of presentation that I want to go. I really, really, really want to go. So more or less, and she'd like, at least she did say she would like to have him go with her, but it would appear that she realizes that that might not be so likely because of the way Lord Shiva was offended by Daksha, by her father, that at least she doesn't want that he will stop her. Malicious, heart-piercing speeches delivered by Daksha. Heart-piercing. You know, there's a certain level of criticism which is just heart-piercing, and in that way devastating. And that's what happened to Lord Shiva. And but here the sort of the challenging thing as far as understanding all of this is that Lord Shiva, generally we understand, and Srila Prabhupada points out very clearly, that Lord Shiva is a liberated personality. Lord Shiva is Atmarama, situated in complete self-realization. So it's an interesting question. How could a liberated person situated in complete self-realization become, at least we could say, somewhat distressed, somewhat disturbed by this very strong, very abusive, and just so intentionally insulting talk of Daksha, a transcendental personality. A transcendental personality, if they're glorified for being very wonderful, which they are, and oftentimes that will show, and people will see, oh, look, what a wonderful person. And so then they're glorified. But generally speaking, a great devotee like that, if they're glorified, they will just discount it altogether or just disagree strongly. If you've read Brihad Bhagavatamrita or listened to the seminar we did on it, last year sometime, we went through the entire thing, and we saw there that in the first part, in which Narada Muni is trying to find out who is the most wonderful person, the most qualified person, then one after another, different persons are recommended to him that such and such is the most wonderful person, the most glorious person, the person with the greatest qualifications and most wonderful qualities like that. And so Narada Muni then goes to meet that person and glorifies them as he has heard the glories of that person from the person who pointed him to go there. So he glorifies whoever it is. But then that person turns around and says, no, I'm not glorious. Not only am I not glorious, but I'm completely out of it. That's basically the idea. Not only am I not glorious, but I am just totally lacking in any good fortune, good qualities, good fortune, mercy. Because the idea was, who has got the most mercy? That was ultimately the idea, although good fortune was also discussed. So yes, it's interesting that the great devotees, they may be appreciated, they are appreciated in different ways, but they themselves feel they're completely lacking in qualification, in qualities, and they haven't really received any mercy. So Lord Shiva, well, actually Lord Shiva is one of those persons. who is approached by Narada Muni. He's one of those persons. And he completely decries himself and in many ways says that he's got no mercy from the Lord at all. So this is natural of a devotee, particularly an advanced devotee, to be transcendental to glorification, to be transcendental to criticism, and even to welcome criticism. But here, Lord Shiva is remembering the criticism he received from Daksha, and he's feeling heart sore. In a not really transcendental way. And so the question is, how could someone like Lord Shiva become disturbed when he remembers the insults? And Srila Prabhupada gives interesting explanation. His explanation is that because Lord Shiva is the incarnation in charge of the material mode of ignorance, tamagun, he is sometimes affected by the pleasure and pain of the material world. And then Prabhupada goes on to contrast, to point out the difference between the pleasures and pains on the material level and how people who are materially conditioned react to them, and the pleasures and the pains which may be there in the spiritual world, and how the devotees, particularly in the spiritual world, but even any more advanced devotees at least, but particularly in the spiritual world, they respond to pleasures and particularly in this case pains. It's very interesting. Of course, it's very interesting just the point that even though Lord Shiva is liberated personality, situated in complete self-realization, but because he has the service of dealing with the mode of ignorance, then in some situations he reacts in a way which reflects the influence of the mode of ignorance. Anyway, we'll let you all sort of meditate on that one. It's an interesting one. And we hope are you awake? Are you alive? Have we lost anyone? Has anyone given up their lives? That's one of the problems of being in this big space, that there's not so much contact and the tendency to drift away is a bit greater. Therefore, sometimes some devotees have the strategy in a situation like this, every so many minutes, make a joke, and then the devotees wake up. That was a joke, by the way. But still, it's true. But as I told you, as I've mentioned before, when I was a really new devotee in London, the idea came from America. It was imported from America, as all good things are. That's another joke too. Not much of a joke. In America, the devotee with the service called Temple Commander, some of the temple commanders had adopted the ingenious practice of keeping a water pistol with them. And during the morning program, when devotees, at least someone or someones would inevitably fall asleep, he would squirt them with prasadam water, of course. It wouldn't be just tap water. Maybe we should do that, but I'd need a long-range water pistol. So yes, Lord Shiva, even though he's liberated personality, completely situated in self-realization, but because of his service and the conditions of his service, dealing with the mode of ignorance. And also, Prabhupada doesn't mention here exactly, but in other places Prabhupada definitely mentions that he is married to the personality who is the presiding deity of the material nature, Maya Devi, who has all the potency, all the potencies of all the different modes of material nature and just the complete potency of the material nature. And because of being in such close contact with her, like more or less 24/7, it has some effect on him. But still, even though it has some effect, as Prabhupada's pointing out here, it doesn't really mean he's become disqualified. Otherwise, generally, people who are influenced by the modes of material nature, like us, that those influences of the material nature, they create disqualification, spiritual disqualification, and sometimes the disqualification becomes so strong that some people even stop practicing Krishna consciousness altogether or practice much less, something like that. But here in the case of Lord Shiva, it's very interesting. He's the head of one of the sampradayas, and he's a great Vaishnava, Vaishnavanam Yata Shambhu. In one sense, he's the greatest of all the Vaishnavas, but sometimes, circumstantially, there is some effect on him and on his behavior coming from his closeness to the material nature. Anyway, that's a kind of very deep transcendental subject. And he's not the only one. We're going to be reading later, after some weeks or months, we'll read about Dhruva Maharaj, how he became great pure devotee, personal associate of the Lord, but then he became overcome by anger. So anyway, as we go through these types of things, we'll discuss the implications of these things, but it's a very interesting aspect of Krishna consciousness. I could mention, as I may have mentioned a few days ago, I did actually, how when Srila Prabhupada was in Mauritius, he gave a class in one temple explaining how Bhagavad Gita is beneficial because through following the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, you become transcendental and unaffected by the material nature and even by death. And one gentleman objected and said that, I don't think it works because Arjuna, if you remember, if you're awake, Arjuna, when his son was killed, his son Abhimanyu was killed in the battle of with anger and took the vow to kill the person who was responsible for the death of his son Jayadratha, to kill him the next day. And if he failed, he would commit suicide. And it was just, he got into a very extreme state of mind, very emotional state. And so this man said, yeah, when his son was killed, he didn't just, relax and everything's okay because I'm Krishna conscious and my son's a spirit soul, etc. He became affected. And Srila Prabhupada made the point that it's natural to become affected in such a situation because we are not stones. We are not just rocks which have no feelings. We are persons. And as persons, we're full of feelings. But Prabhupada then made the point that the proof that Arjuna was actually qualified as a devotee and qualified in terms of Bhagavad Gita was that he continued doing his service. He didn't stop doing his service. He didn't stop his Krishna conscious activity, but he carried on. That being like the crucial point. So in the spiritual world, there's pleasure and pain also. Lord Krishna, Prabhupada mentions here, that Lord Krishna was chastised by Mother Yashoda. Of course, we remember the Damodar Leela and how Krishna got really upset and he cried. And he became angry and he reacted. He smashed the pot, the yogurt pot in which the yogurt was being churned into butter. He smashed it and it all came out on the floor. And then he was even more angry and he climbed up and smashed some pots that were hanging from the ceiling. Pots of various dairy products, and all of that came down. And then he started eating some butter, and after he'd had enough, he started feeding butter to the monkeys until they were overloaded with butter. And the monkeys were refusing. He was offering, come on, take it, take it. The monkeys were refusing. And Mother Yashoda came in, and Krishna, in his mischievous way, said to Mother Yashoda, just see, Mata, your butter is so bad, even the monkeys won't eat it. Because he knew it was a sensitive point with Mother Yashoda. Why? I give him all this butter. I give him kilos of butter. He can just eat as much as he likes. He has a little bit and he goes and steals some butter from someone else's house. So she had a bit of a complex about her butter. And Krishna, in a mischievous way, even you could say transcendentally, a little nasty way, he goaded her like that. Of course, it's all part of the transcendental exchanges. But then, then she tied him. He was crying, but as Prabhupada explains here, even though these things are happening like this, and even though Krishna himself sometimes seems to be distressed, and sometimes he irritates the gopis, and sometimes the gopis chastise him and tell him he's just something not very nice. and he reacts to that. But it's all on the transcendental level, and it's all just exchanges of bliss. And therefore, even though Krishna is crying and apparently disturbed, being chastised by Mother Yashoda, he is simply in ecstasy. Now, these are all transcendental, these are all different aspects of transcendental life. And in some cases, they contradict our experiences within this material world, how people act and react to different stimuli. And one devotee, I was just reading a few weeks ago, one devotee asked Prabhupada, how do we understand these things, these apparent contradictions? And at that time, Srila Prabhupada said, well, to find out, to understand, you will have to go there and become part of it, and then it'll become clearer to you. So, yes, but the situation of Lord Shiva becoming disturbed or unhappy because of the criticisms of Daksha, there's a type of material influence there due to his being in charge of the mode of ignorance and married to, in the constant association of the embodiment of the material nature. But still, it doesn't really affect his position of being liberated and situated in complete self-realization. Hare Krishna. Any comments or questions? Jai, help us. Yeah.
Hare Krishna. Early on you mentioned about criticism.
About what?
Criticism.
Oh, criticism, yeah.
In Vaishnava etiquette we learn, under the heading Vaishnava Parad, we learn that we can criticize somebody in a constructive way to help them, and converse to that we can criticize them in a destructive way to destroy them. So in this case we see Daksha, and it's a classic case of Vaishnava Parad with Daksha and Lord Shiva in that pastime there.
Yeah.
Then the other point is that up to this point, Sati is like the favorite daughter of all the daughters of Daksha. And one would think that Lord Shiva, being the son-in-law, would be a beneficiary of the sentiments of Daksha, but we see the opposite. It's become the recipient of all the criticism, destructive criticism. Thank you.
That's a comment, right? Yes. Thank you. Well, a good practice for us as devotees is, if you can't, in our interactions, if you can't say something good about someone, don't say anything at all, or just talk about Krishna consciousness. Because aparad, Daksha, as a result of his aparad, he gets the head of a goat. Talk about, sometimes a devotee makes a mistake, and like an embarrassing type of mistake, and other devotees find out about it. And the devotee, therefore becomes a little bit of an object of, is in an embarrassing situation because others know, but not Not like what happened with Lord Shiva. That criticism was just so extreme. Very, very extreme. Initially, he didn't react at all. He just walked away. He just left without reacting. But here we can see that there's something's there. Something's there. At least some feeling of disappointment. He was sorry at heart, Srila Prabhupada says. He certainly maintains equilibrium, basic equilibrium. But he's still unhappy because of the words of Daksha. So anyway, for ourselves, if we see that a devotee is apparently doing something wrong, then we definitely shouldn't just take that and spread the word and criticize them. If we see that a devotee is arguably doing something wrong, we should try and help them if we can, and if we can't, then we should try and get someone who could help them to try and help them. But criticism, the idea of constructive criticism, it can easily become a pretty destructive type of thing, actually. Anyway, thank you. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.